let's start with the genre history, which in fact goes back several decades before Shaw Brothers even existed. Martial arts films derive from popular Chinese literature, which in turn gets going towards the end of the 19th century and into the early years of the 20th century. And inevitably, perhaps, popular fiction, which is successful and widely read, becomes the basis for films in the emergent Shanghai film industry in the 1920s. This time, we will put it in historical perspective, the Chinese imperial system, the last dynasty was the Qing dynasty, the Manchu dynasty, collapsed in 1911 under Sun Yat-sen's revolution. And Puyi, the last emperor, you know this from the Bertolucci film, Puyi fled into exile, became a Japanese puppet in Manchuria, and all this history we don't need to go into. But the key thing is that mainland China, after the collapse of the Qing dynasty, descended into a kind of chaos for which lasted well over a decade, nearly 2 decades basically, of what's known now as the warlord era. This has proved to be a useful background for quite a lot of martial arts films subsequently. It wasn't at the time, but there was a lot of lawlessness, there was a lot of local authority, tyranny, there were politically it was a chaotic period in China. The Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist party, known as the KMT, usually in English, was formed on the basis that it would reunify China. It would bring China back together under a central political authority. And his main effort was designed to outlaw regionalism, to outlaw the warlords, to overcome the warlords and to rule from the center, as it were. Well, in that context, martial arts fiction became quite a big deal in China's newspapers. Most of it was serialized in newspapers before being collected and published as novels. And inevitably it sparked film adaptations. Film adaptations got going in the late 20s, about 27 or thereabouts. The most famous known example is a film called The Burning of the Red Lotus Monastery, which was so successful it led to 17 sequels being made in rapid succession. And these are films, again, based on martial arts fiction, published fiction, but with rather primitive special effects. Some of them painted directly onto the film frame, with palm power being demonstrated and that kind of thing. And they were immensely popular. Precisely one example of this genre from that time survives, and it's in very poor condition in the China Film Archive. And it's a film, actually coincidentally, it's a film about a heroine, a martial heroine rather than a hero. She's known as Red Knight. And the film is not very good, but we have no way of knowing how typical it was of the genre, or whether this was a particularly poor example or a particularly good example. If it was a good example, they had a lot to worry about. Anyway, the key thing here is that the Kuomintang government, the KMT, banned the genre in the early 30s because it was feared that it would foment dissent. It would militate against the reunification of the country. It would reinforce the idea that authority was there to be toppled, and that adventurism and forming rebel groups and such like, which is a recurrent motif in martial arts fiction, might give people the wrong ideas and not help the cause of the KMT. So the genre was suppressed for quite a while, in the mainland, that is. It resurfaces in Hong Kong in the years after the war, after the Japanese defeat. Hong Kong falls to the Japanese in 1941. The Japanese obviously retreat in 1945 when the war ends, and Hong Kong begins to pick up the pieces. Hong Kong at this time is a rather sleepy colonial port, but it's nothing very exciting is happening there. But it is becoming a bit of a haven. People are beginning to understand that the fact that there's British rule of law practiced in Hong Kong is not generating anti-colonial feeling at the time, but it is creating a certain respect for the fact that here is a Chinese enclave which is governed by law. It is not lawless in the sense that much of mainland still is. And mainland, anyway, in the late 40s, of course, is being overtaken by the civil war between the communists and the nationalists, which ends with the communist victory and the nationalist retreat to Taiwan. So, the genre resurfaces in Hong Kong. It resurfaces in cinema, Cantonese language cinema. Hong Kong is a Cantonese speaking territory, basically, or has been until fairly recently. Majority, it's in the south of China. Cantonese is the dominant dialect of South China, and it's the lingua franca of Hong Kong. English is the legal language of Hong Kong, and many people speak English and learn it at school, or have done anyway in the past. Everything changes, of course, under recent political shifts in Hong Kong. But this was the situation in the late 40s. And the film industry gets going. There has been a certain amount of filmmaking in Hong Kong before the war, and even, I think, not much during the war, as far as I'm aware. But but before Hong Kong fell to the Japanese, and there were isolated initiatives, people fled from Shanghai or from Guangzhou to Hong Kong and tried to make films in Hong Kong, supporting the anti-Japanese war effort at the time. That, I think, didn't continue during the war years. A lot of mainland intellectuals, including many artists and writers, fled to Hong Kong to get away from the Japanese, but were chased by the Japanese in Hong Kong. And of course, when Hong Kong fell to the Japanese in 1941, they had no choice but to go back into the mainland. Most of them took refuge in the far west of the country, down the Yangtze River in Chongqing and places like that. So, Hong Kong is producing martial arts fiction in its newspapers. People start to write martial arts serials. If you've ever seen Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love or 2046, you'll know that the character played by Tony Leung in those films writes serialized martial arts fiction for newspapers. That's set, I think, later in the 1960s. Both those films are period pieces for Hong Kong, but they reflect a reality, a social reality, which is that one of the main money-earning schemes for a would-be writer, or anybody who's trying to make a freelance go of things, is to generate martial arts fiction in the form of a serial. And in fact, the film's Wong Kar-wai's script makes fun of the fact that they keep forgetting what special powers the characters have and whether so-and-so is present in this scene or not. And there are various kind of little in-jokes about the shoddiness of writing martial arts serials in the papers. Nonetheless, they become very popular. And at the same time, Cantonese cinema gets going. Mandarin cinema, we'll come back to this in a bit, because Mandarin cinema makes an appearance in Hong Kong in the late 40s, mostly because entrepreneurs, producers, executive producers, company owners have relocated from Shanghai to Hong Kong, but also some talent has. Some filmmakers, some writers, some directors, some actors have fled the Civil War, seeing the way things are going in China, and moved to Hong Kong for safety, for refuge from it. King Hu would be an example, although he was not involved with filmmaking at the time. In that context, the Cantonese cinema is the one that is catering to the local audience. There's no television, broadcast or otherwise, in Hong Kong until the late 1950s, when a cable system called rediffusion television comes into existence, but it's not available to a lot of people, particularly not in the public housing estates. So cinema is a proto-television, in effect, at that time. And Cantonese cinema is producing enormous numbers of quickies, often in very long serials, very much like TV soaps, in effect. I'm not saying they're conceptually exactly the same as TV soaps, but they fulfilled the function, the later function of a TV soap. And also cinemas, almost nobody at that point had air conditioning at home. So going to the cinema, which usually did have air conditioning, when initially they just had propeller fans in the ceilings, but later that was taken over by air conditioning as we know it today, or a primitive form of it. And spending a couple of hours away from the heat of Hong Kong in a relatively cool and air-conditioned place was very attractive. So people went to the movies, and all kinds of genres were made by the Cantonese film industry, but that included martial arts cinema. The most famous example would be the Wong Fei Hung series, which there were ultimately more than 50 titles, in which Wong Fei Hung was always played by an actor called Quan Tak Hing, who became so closely associated with the character that late in life, when the series had stopped, he was still thought of as Wong Fei Hung. He made some, after the main series ended, he made a few guest appearances in films for Golden Harvest, reprising his greatest role, the role for which he was known for the rest of his life. Why did Mandarin cinema get going in a Cantonese-speaking territory? Well, mostly because a lot of the émigrés, particularly from the Shanghai film industry, didn't speak Cantonese, but also for other reasons. There were political imperatives, right-wing and left-wing. Some of the most active companies producing Mandarin language films in Hong Kong in the late 40s, early 50s were so-called left-wing companies. Being left-wing in Hong Kong at that time did not mean being, virulently communist. These are not the, Bernie Sanders fans of their day. They are it's simply pro-China. They are optimistic about China's future under the Communist Party. That's essentially what it means. But there are three companies established in Hong Kong in the 1950s, early 1950s, that are what is considered to be left-wing companies, pro-China companies. Two are making films in Mandarin, one is making films in Cantonese. Much, much later, in the late 70s, they amalgamated into one company called Sil Metropole, which continued producing films often on location in China or in association with China, and then sort of petered out because China film policy changed so much, and commercial imperatives started to intrude, and they were unable to keep up with it all. Anyhow, we have a situation where Mandarin films are being made in Hong Kong, not only by these so-called left-wing companies, but also by right-wing companies, like the Shaws, for example. The Shaw family had begun in Shanghai in the 1920s. They had a company called Tianyi in Chinese, which in English it was registered as Unique Film Corporation. And Unique was a prolific upstart in the Shanghai film industry and was forced out of the Shanghai film industry by its bigger rivals. The two big companies in Shanghai at the time were the Star Film Company, Mingxing, and United Photoplay, or Lianhua. These two, together with a number of other companies, I think there were 5 in total, formed a kind of cartel to drive these upstart Shaws out. The Shaw family, actually, accurately, they should be called the Shao family. S-H-A-O would be the normal English transliteration. But they, being very forward-thinking and very Western educated and very clued up in business, called themselves Shaw pretty much from the beginning, I think. They anglicised their name to Shaw. So the Shao family, anyway, responded to this clampdown on their products, being frozen out of the Shanghai market, their films not being granted exhibition space in the cinemas, by moving abroad. They carried on operating in China, but they were making films essentially for export. And the brothers, there were 6 altogether, 4 of whom are prominent in the film business, went to Southeast Asia. They were based in Singapore, Malaysia, but they were active also in Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, other countries in the region where there was a demand for film and there was a significant Chinese presence in the population. There was quite a lot of anti-China prejudice in some of those countries. Indonesia, of course, much later had riots destroying Chinese businesses and attacking Chinese people. Thailand went through similar things. but actually the truth is that nearly all the film industry initiatives in the region were initiated by Chinese entrepreneurs. Sometimes they had to take native names in order to pass muster for non-immigrants. So in Thailand, I mean, virtually all the big companies in Thailand were started by people of Chinese descent, but they took Thai names to disguise their Chinese identity. One of those things. Anyway, the Shaws were there. The Shaws were based in Singapore initially and active. At that time, Singapore and Malaysia, or Malaya as it was called, were unified. They were part of a unified territory. And Run Run, the youngest of the six brothers, was the one sent to run things down there. His name in Chinese is Xiao Yifu. And Run Run is supposedly a Malaysian honorific prefix. But they all had them. They were all given these Malaysian prefixes for their names. So Run Run is active down in Singapore. The operation in Hong Kong is called Shaw and Sons, not Shaw Brothers, and it's run by an older brother called Rundy Shaw. Rundy Shaw doesn't make much of a fist of it. So in the 50s, as Mandarin language cinema advances, and Mandarin cinema has, great export potential anyway. I mean, this is, of course, decades after the Shanghai operation was forced to basically focus on export. But Mandarin cinema is a kind of gives, as in China itself, Mandarin language filmmaking has a kind of cachet as a unifying force. China didn't really have a national language until movies came along, followed by radio and ultimately by television, of course, which all had to be in some intelligible language. And that language was Mandarin, which is a slightly simplified adaptation of the Beijing dialect, created basically by the Manchus. When the Manchus invaded and founded the Qing dynasty, they didn't speak Chinese. They had to invent a Chinese for themselves to rule in, because you can't rule China without speaking Chinese. And the Qing dynasty came up with what we now think of as Mandarin, or the communists call it Putonghua, or common language, to do the job. So here we have this situation with language becoming a national unifier. And movies played a significant part in that. When talkies came into Chinese cinema in the mid-30s, they were in Mandarin, and they, although not that much of the country could see movies at the time, there weren't very many cinemas and distribution was very limited inside China. They were in Mandarin, and it helped to propagate the idea that Mandarin was the national language. They created a sense of national unity. And it had the same effect in Hong Kong. From the beginning, in the late 40s, Mandarin film companies in Hong Kong promoted the idea of a kind of unified China. They promoted the idea that China was fine under its new government, this new communist government. People were still feeling their way. Nobody had any idea until about the mid-50s that the communists could be so repressive and so destructive. So for the first 5 or 6 years of communist rule in China, people were benign and optimistic, basically, much of the time. That wasn't really disrupted until the Cultural Revolution broke out in the mid-60s, at which point, of course, the left-wing film companies in Hong Kong were paralyzed. They had to stop making films because China had stopped making films and they didn't know what to do. They were no longer getting leadership from Beijing, which they had been enjoying up to that point. Anyhow, in this context, Mandarin filmmaking in the 50s and early 60s was prestigious. Mandarin films tended to have higher budgets than Cantonese films. They were more carefully made. They were shown in better theatres in Hong Kong. Theatres, larger theatres, theatres with genuine air conditioning. As one friend once put it to me in Hong Kong, if you wanted to take your boyfriend or girlfriend to a date, you would take them to a Mandarin film because it was more prestigious. It was a little bit more expensive, not much, slightly more expensive, but it was a better experience. It was a classier date. So Mandarin films had a certain cachet in Hong Kong society. And of course it propagated the language in Hong Kong just as it had done in China. And a lot of Cantonese speaking folk in Hong Kong either had to learn Mandarin, which they did from the soundtracks of the films, or by reading the subtitles. You will have noticed that it became routine in Hong Kong already in the early 60s for films to be subtitled in Chinese, right to left, and English, left to right. That was basically for the export market. It was because Hong Kong was beginning to produce films for the region, for Southeast Asia and East Asia. In countries like Korea and Japan, films will be dubbed into the local language. In the rest of the countries of the region, that's to say the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, to some extent Vietnam until the war put an end to it, there was an assumption that either the audience would be able to read the Chinese subtitles and thereby get the meaning from that, even if they didn't speak Mandarin, or they could read the English subtitles, particularly in a country like the Philippines, where the Chinese percentage of the public was relatively small and relatively elite, furthermore. So there was, less chance of them being common or garden moviegoers. Anyhow, you have a situation where Hong Kong is beginning to understand that its future fortune in the film industry lies in catering to the needs of East Asia as a whole. And this really comes into its own in the 1970s in a big way. I said before that Rundy Shaw, with his company Shaw and Sons, was not making much of a fist of it. He didn't do that well. He was certainly not up to the family's own expectations. So what happened after a certain conference that took place presumably in Shanghai in the years after the Japanese defeat was that the youngest brother, Run Run, Xiao Yifu, was seconded from Singapore to Hong Kong to take over the operation in Hong Kong and make it profitable, make it more dynamic, make it more exciting. So Rundy, his elder brother, was still there, and Shaw and Sons continued existing. The two companies existed side by side for quite a long time. And Rundy took no part in the formation of or running of Shaw Brothers, which was the new company set up by Run Run when he arrived from Singapore in 56, 57, we don't know exactly what year it was, but around that time. He immediately sets about building a new production centre. He chooses a place outside urban Hong Kong. It's in on the edge of the so-called New Territories, the land leased from China, a big crescent of land surrounding Hong Kong, which is basically peninsular Hong Kong. It sticks out into the sea, and there's a big island just off the peninsula. So that's the core of Hong Kong. But there's this big crescent of land that came to be known as the New Territories, which was leased from China. That was what eventually led to Hong Kong being returned to Chinese sovereignty, because the lease ran out and Hong Kong couldn't exist without that crescent of land around it. Anyway, Run Run looked into that area, looked to the northeast of Hong Kong, an area called Clearwater Bay, and he built Shaw's Movietown. Shaw's Movietown was designed from the get-go to be a one-stop shop for film production distribution. Everything was there, perhaps not all from the very start, but it soon was added to make it a complete facility. Number one, it contained a number of studio spaces. Nothing was designed to be shot with sound at that point. That came quite a bit later in the 1970s. So everything was initially shot silent and post-synced, sometimes by the actors themselves, more often not by a dubbing crew. In addition, there were laboratory facilities, so that every foot of film that was exposed in those studios was processed on the premises and printed on the premises. So there was no farming out of any of the processing work, no exterior labs were used, it was all in-house. If you wanted to have work done like printing scripts, printing posters, publicity materials, in-house department was set up. If you wanted to have your key talent at hand, build them apartments. So there's the so-called dormitory blocks at Shaw Brothers housed the key talents, mostly directors, writers, some production executives, and a few favoured actors were given apartments. I went to those blocks. They're quite nice, spacious apartments, rather well designed. I mean, basic, but nothing fancy, no fancy design features, but they were good, spacious apartments where people could live very comfortably. And they had modern plumbing and air conditioning and all the other mod cons that people expected. The Shaws wanted to be self-contained, opulent. At the centre of the complex is a villa, which is where Run Shaw himself was supposedly living. He didn't actually live there much of the time, but it was his residence in the studio, and it had beneath it a screening room, a preview theatre, where he would look at everything that was produced. And he was not a hands-on producer in the sense of interfering day to day with the production of films, or he didn't want to read scripts, I don't think. He didn't want to interfere at any level during the production, but he did want to see everything that when it was finished before he would authorize it for release. And occasionally he would ask for changes or alterations or deletions or whatever. So he ran the place rather autocratically. If you know, whatever he said went. So if he was not satisfied with something, he would have it stopped or changed. There were famously several films that began shooting. Rumours reached Run that things were not going well. He called in the key people, he looked at the rushes or the material so far shot, and in a few cases he shut down the production. So films were abandoned during production. This happened quite a number of times. There are plenty of recorded instances of it. So he, in the 1970s, when things really begin to prosper for Shaw Brothers, when their theatre chain in Hong Kong is the most powerful probably of all of them, and their export market is very comfortably assured. They have a nice change of distribution around Southeast Asia and East Asia. They're selling films to Japan and Korea. Everything is going smoothly for them for quite a while in the 70s. It's their peak decade, I think it's fair to say. Shaw himself, Run, sort of retreats from the business. He seems to get a bit bored with it. We don't really know. I met Run only once, and the conversation was entirely about money. Mr. Rayns, you have to understand, we have to be concerned about the bottom line. And I said, yes, sir, Run, I'm sure you're right. As I'm trying to get him to do something without paying for it, without us paying for it. He eventually did concede, to his credit. I have to say that it took some persuading, but he let us have 4 films to screen in a special Hong Kong Film Festival. But that was the occasion for our meeting, and it was clear that his primary motivation was mercenary. He had taken on a nightclub chanteuse, or chanteuse, as they used to say in Damon Runyon movies, called Mona Fong. And she was effectively his wife. I guess they did marry. I'm not completely sure that they went through the rigmarole, but she was certainly his late life partner. And he delegated much of the responsibility for running the studio to her. Mona Fong was a much hated woman in the studio. She was detested by most of the creative staff. Zhang Che, for example, Zhang Che published a memoir, which we'll come to a little bit later on. But Zhang Che was, let's say, Zhang Che was not that impressed by powerful women. That's a slightly euphemistic way of putting it, but there it is. Mona Fong in Zhang Che's memoirs gets, I think, two brief mentions, both of them very dismissive, all along the lines of, well, she was, of course, Run Run's wife, so she doesn't count. This is not a respecter of feminist principles or the idea that anybody could be important and significant if she happened to have the misfortune to be a woman. I met Mona only one time, and it was also for some kind of negotiation. But she had in the early 1980s, about 84, she had hired the Hong Kong director An Hui to make a film. An Hui had the ambition to film an Eileen Chang novel called Love in a Fallen City, and she could only do it with the resources of Shaw Brothers. She needed something bigger than any of the indie companies in Hong Kong could provide. And so she turned to Shaw's, and Mona welcomed her and made all kinds of promises that this would be different. They wouldn't withhold the film from festivals. They would be very happy to promote it culturally. There would be all these things would be good. And Anne asked me if I would have a meeting with Mona to discuss strategy for these things. So I did. It was a salutary meeting because Mona was not very interested in discussing any of those things at all. She was only interested in knowing how I'd had access to anything in Shaw Brothers in the past. Who had made that possible? Who showed you those films? She was furious and raging. And in fact, a former Shaw executive approached me more recently and asked if I would like to write a novel in English with the inside story of the relationship between Mona Fong and Run Run Shaw. This man hated Mona Fong with a vengeance. He kind of liked Run Run, I think, in a certain way, and was sort of indulgent towards him, but not Mona, whom he detested and despised, and who eventually had forced him to leave Shaw Brothers, or encouraged him to at least. He wanted me to. He was terrified of being sued by Mona if he spilled the beans on the relationship, the inside story of the relationship. So he thought it needed to be fictionalized. He'd been told by a Hong Kong lawyer that if he did it in Hong Kong, she'd be on him like a ton of bricks with legal challenges. But so he thought, well, maybe we can do it in England and change the names, and I can do it that way. And I didn't wish to be involved with this, and didn't feel that it was in any way a goer. It's hard to believe that anybody would care really about these things. But in any event, Mona then obligingly died, not long after Run Run, and the issue became irrelevant. I mean, nobody cares anymore. It's all over. And the old Shaw Brothers story has basically come to an end. I mean, Shaw himself devolved his attention and most of the studio space in Movietown to TV production. He's the main shareholder was the main shareholder in a company called TVB, which was the first broadcast television, non-cable television, effectively, in Hong Kong. And from its launch right through to the present day, is the single most powerful force in Hong Kong television. So Run Run was running that, or he was the Rupert Murdoch figure at the head of it, let's say, and it thrived and prospered in the way that the film was allowed to decline and decline and decline until it basically stopped in the mid-80s. And since then, there were just a few one-off initiatives, involvement in films, some Hollywood films and some other things that they chose to make just to keep their hand in, as it were, or just because Mona was perhaps nostalgic for the power that she'd enjoyed at the studio. But Mona was somebody I discovered the hard way who never had the slightest interest in the creative aspects of filmmaking. She also was taught by her husband or partner, was interested primarily in the bottom line. And so what she cared about was where was the money going and how much money was coming back, where was it coming from? So her interest in the creative talents that she employed and bossed around was minimal. Run Run was probably a bit more respectful, but he was mostly respectful to the older people who, like him, had originally come from Shanghai. The directors of the films in this set, all made in the late 1960s, Pretty much all of them came from China, and some of them were nearly Run's age, born around the same time. The oldest director in this set is Yue Feng, who was born in 1910 in Shanghai. So by the time he made Bells of Death, which is one of the best films in this set, and he's, I think, probably the best director in this set, although Zhang Jie obviously has a major claim. Yue Feng had a distinguished career in Shanghai cinema before he came to Hong Kong. He's one of the first to come to Hong Kong in about 48 or thereabouts. Makes films for leftist companies and rightist companies in Mandarin in Hong Kong, and fetches up at Shaw Brothers in, I think, the early 60s. He makes a film called The Swallow, which is a proto-martial arts film in the early 60s for Shaw Brothers. So he's one of the first directors hired to work under the new company, alongside Li Hanxiang, who is another veteran of northern China, and who has had a, shall we say, a checkered career in the Hong Kong film business in the 1950s. But he's a close friend and mentor of King Hu, so he has a pretty important role here, as well as having made dozens and dozens of films, some of them very significant. Now, in the 50s, Mandarin language filmmaking in Hong Kong was very general. As I said, there were right-wing companies and left-wing companies, pro and anti-China companies. Nobody was attacking China directly in the right-wing films. Nobody was praising the communists directly in the left-wing films. But both films, curiously, both types of film, were fostering a notion that the nation was somehow united and on the right path. They were either proclaiming an implied national unity or aggravating for social change in Hong Kong in a way that wouldn't explicitly say go communist, but which would be implicitly critical of the colonial administration that was leading Hong Kong in certain directions. This was general stuff. It was designed to appeal to the widest possible audience in Hong Kong, given that Hong Kong was not basically Mandarin speaking. That shifted as Mandarin cinema became well established and a bigger deal in the late 50s, around the time that Shaw's Movie Town opened and that Shaw Brothers was an established company, when the female audience was specifically targeted by much Mandarin language filmmaking. There were a lot of films that were historical spectacles, often featuring empresses or prominent women characters, and female stars were the biggest stars of the period. Or so-called opera films. Huang Mei opera was the most popular form, and Huang Mei is more like Rodgers and Hammerstein actually than Peking opera. But a lot of singing, a lot of prettified flouncing around, a certain amount of cross-dressing, a lot of girls pretending to be boys and that kind of thing. And romantic melodramas, tales of thwarted love affairs and such like. These were predominantly aimed at the female audience. And that was the convention that obtained right through till the end of the 60s, really. But in the mid-60s, things began to change. It began to change for a number of reasons. One is that a screenwriter, originally from Shanghai or near Shanghai, who had been working in Taiwan, came to Hong Kong as a writer, worked on scripts for a few Shaw Brothers films, and then turned director in 63. His name was Zhang Jie, or his professional name was Zhang Jie, not his actual birth name. And Zhang Jie fitted in with the current of the times. Basically, he was perfectly happy to make this kind of romantic melodrama, but he wanted to do action films. Himself not a man of action. This is a classic case of a kind of weedy intellectual type with absolutely no martial skills of his own and no expertise, no knowledge, not even any great interest, to be frank, but an intellectual having an outright fascination with macho males, and particularly their martyrdom, their violent deaths, their prowess, their skill, their honour, their valour, and their heroic deaths. He first gave vent to this fascination in a film that I haven't seen and wish I had. I'd love to see it, called Tiger Boy, which was the debut on screen of the actor Wang Yu. Wang Yu had been a swimming champion in mainland China. He's from the south. He's from Canton, I think, Guangzhou. But he had fetched up in Hong Kong. He won some kind of prize and was taken on by Shaw Brothers as a very low-paid actor. And Tiger Boy was his first film. It was shot in black and white. It was very low budget. Law Li was born in Indonesia, in Chinese descent also, co-starred in the thing. And it was by all accounts a remarkable film. I mean, I'm going by the accounts of veteran critics in Hong Kong who remember it and speak of it. But Celestial has not, for some reason, restored this film, or probably because it was in black and white. They thought it was not interesting for their streamer markets or satellite broadcasters that they were catering to, and so they didn't bother. But so I hope that the film survives, is not lost, and that one day it will come to light. But it should have been part of that package of 700 odd films that Celestial Pictures, the Malaysian company, bought from Shaw Brothers and started restoring for sets like this one. So here we have a film that stands against the trend towards female-led melodrama. I suppose we could think of it as the equivalent in Hong Kong of a B-movie in a way. There was no tradition of putting films out in double bills in Hong Kong. Each film had its own slot. And Tiger Boy was, by all accounts, not a particularly successful title, but it was unequivocally a male-led adventure story with a lot of action in it. And the action was of a type that was dominated by specifically Chinese martial arts. Strong influence from Japanese popular cinema at this time in Hong Kong. Shaw Brothers, for example, was the Hong Kong distributor of Daiei's Zatoichi series. So when you look at films in this set and you notice that there are quite a number of characters going blind, or there are a couple of, I mean, you won't see it particularly in this film, but in these films, but there is also physical handicapping, arms being sliced off, that kind of thing. Law Li does lose the use of his legs in one of these films, so that would fit. And Wang Yu, who loved to suffer on screen, I mean, more so, he was of all actors since Marlon Brando, he was probably the most masochistic in being drawn to roles in which he was seen to suffer excruciating physical pain and disability, only to fight back. So you can. I think it's a clear case with Wang Yu that you can't think of him as the author of these films, of the films that he's in, but he certainly has some creative input into the films, and he makes it known to everybody involved that he loves to suffer on screen. He loves to be seen in pain and misery and suffering disabilities and handicaps and such. So he recently died. He died in 2022, sadly, in Taiwan, having made a few acting appearances in his old age, but basically being retired from the screen. And he was a singular character. I mean, I think in his way as important and prominent as Bruce Lee. And he chafed under the miserable salaries that Run Run Shaw paid, and having made The Chinese Boxer, which was his own proto-kung fu film. I mean, it uses all kinds of exotic special effects and exotic weaponry, but it had basically the idea of Bruce Lee's Game of Death. Later, it was a film in which a Chinese hero would fight other disciplines, would fight people from other races, other nationalities, and with other fighting styles, and thereby demonstrate the superiority of Chinese martial arts. So nationalistic imperative in play there. But having made that film, he presumed to walk out on his Shaw Brothers contract, followed Raymond Chow to Golden Harvest, and started making films for Golden Harvest. Shaw's immediately filed legal suit, under British law, to prosecute him, to stop him doing things for other people, because he was still under contract to them. So he decamped to Taiwan and simply made films for Golden Harvest in Taiwan. And he remained in legal dispute with Shaw Brothers for many, many years. I think that, The case never came to court, so Shaw's never sorted it out. The rise of Chung Pei in the West, she's known primarily because of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, of course, and she's gone on to appear in some other Western films. She's in, for example, Ivan Sen's magnificent crime thriller Goldstone. She's in a film by Hong Kao in Britain called Lilting with Ben Whishaw, playing a Chinese mother who doesn't understand that her son was gay. She was trained as a dancer. She's retired in New York and occasionally comes out of retirement to take film roles. Obviously, Ang Lee invited her to be in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon as some kind of tribute to her period work in the 1960s for King Hu and other directors. King Hu cast her as a character called Golden Swallow, whom he invented, in the film Come Drink With Me. Having made this film, which was not the biggest hit, it was beaten at the box office by Zhang Che's One-Armed Swordsman soon afterwards. Which was released a little bit later, but it was quite successful. It was quite a big deal, and it was one of the, certainly aesthetically, it was one of the best Hong Kong action films of the mid-60s. And King left Hong Kong, walked out of it. He was under contract to Shaw Brothers as an actor, and he had indeed acted in many Shaw films of the early 60s, just in small parts, nothing big, and no leading roles, as he had acted for other companies before that, before he joined Shaw Brothers. He was also contracted as a screenwriter because that had been one of his activities up to that point. He was brought into Shaw Brothers by Li Hanxiang, his friend and mentor. They were both from North China, and both Li was a little bit older and more successful earlier on. So King had come in as a writer and actor to Shaw Brothers, and after the great success of Come Drink With Me, he walked out. Like many people subsequently, actually Li Hanxiang had already done so. His mentor Li Hanxiang had pointed the way forward. Li had been producing many of Shaw's biggest hits in the late 50s, early 60s, and had walked out, had gone to Taiwan, started his own film company in Taiwan, and tried to make a go of being a Run Shaw of his own. He wanted to be an impresario. He wanted to control the creative output. He wanted to make his own films for his own company, and at the same time supervise films by his friends, and outdo Shaw's basically in Taiwan. Well, King had pretty much the same dream. Went to Taiwan. He didn't join Li Hanxiang's company, but he went with another newly formed company, and he made a film called Dragon Gate Inn, also known as Dragon Inn. And Dragon Inn was finished and released in 1967, so 2 years after he had made Come Drink With Me, 1 year after it was released in Hong Kong. And Dragon Gate Inn was an enormous success, first in Taiwan, then around the region. This was by far the most successful martial arts film or Wuxia film that the region had ever seen at that point, and it was therefore massively influential. So you have a situation where King Hu has walked out, thereby setting an important precedent and making a massively successful film away from Shaw Brothers. Shaw retaliated. Shaw is very bitter about King Hu's departure, and they retaliate by blocking the Hong Kong release of Dragon Gate Inn for as long as they can, and asking their in-house martial arts star director, Zhang Che, to knock out a sequel to Come Drink With Me. This is Golden Swallow. Chung Pei will come back as the character Golden Swallow, last seen in Come Drink With Me, and she will have part two. So it will be another Golden Swallow film, this time to be called Golden Swallow, to emphasize the continuity with the previous film. That's Shaw Brothers' idea, and they do succeed in blocking the release, delaying the release of Dragon Gate in Hong Kong for quite a while. I mean, I think it opens about a year later than elsewhere in East Asia, by which time its reputation, of course, is already sky high. The irony is that Zhang Jie, by this time, we're talking about 1968, is no longer feeling in thrall to the melodrama tradition. If you see the films in this set, the Zhang Jie films, for example, The Assassin, is the earliest one, I think, in this set, followed by Golden Swallow, followed by Flying Darts, followed by The Invincible Fist. All four are included in this set. You can see that he's still paying lip service, at least, to the melodrama tradition. All these films are surprisingly heterosexual, considering his vast number of all-male films made from 72 onwards. So all of his sword heroes are kind of lovelorn and have sentimental attachments, and usually to pitiful, helpless women who need to be protected and saved. And but he's happy to go along with that. But it's rather obvious, pretty much from the start, that what he's really interested in is the heroes. And he developed his own aesthetic. He claimed that this was an active response against the prominence of female stars, top stars being female, in the early 60s. He wanted to restore the balance and give equal chance to the men. And so he made it his business to nurture new male talent. Let's leave that sort of hanging in the air slightly ambiguously. Wang Yu was the first, as I say, a swimming champion from China. Law Li was the second, who appears as a hero in several of these films. He's later most often cast as a villain in subsequent 70s films, but except in perhaps Lau Kar Leung's films, where he tends to have a more saintly aspect to him sometimes. He's, of course, best known as in the West as the hero of a film in China. Well, in Hong Kong it was originally called King Boxer. It became known in the States as Five Fingers of Death, and it was the first Shaw Brothers film acquired by Warner Brothers for distribution. It was very badly dubbed into English, and it was released to enormous success in the US, in Britain, and in other countries by Warner Brothers. It was the first Shaw film to have widespread international circulation. And that sale, the negotiation that went behind it, was prompted, of course, by the enormous success of Bruce Lee at Golden Harvest, the bitter rival Golden Harvest, founded and led by Raymond Chow, who had walked out of Shaw's as a senior executive and started his own new company. His own new company was absolutely a mirror image of Shaw Brothers, but for the first year anyway. But then when Bruce Lee came along, things began to change, and the idea of artist-led production companies became a thing, and Golden Harvest stopped producing all its own films and started instead financing them through smaller indie companies, usually led by stars, and became a distribution company and a financing company rather than a production company as such.
叶梅，你的伤愈了之后，不但功力全部都恢复了，而且还有进的。
这都是靠你的指点呐。
哪里？我们师承不同，武功的路子也不一样，怎么说得上是指点呢？你的剑法轻灵迅速。
So we have a fluid situation, let's put it like that, and Golden Swallow is set up to be a sequel to Come Drink With Me. However, when you watch the film, which you can at last do in high definition in this set, you will find that it's not really much of a sequel to Come Drink With Me. Chung Pei-pei's character, Golden Swallow, is rather sidelined in this movie. She's in love with two men, or torn between two men, one of whom was her classmate and who is now going around slaughtering all the bad guys in the region to attract her attention. and leaving her trademark dart at the scene of all his crimes, so that his extrajudicial killings, we could call them now. And the other guy comes to her rescue when she is wounded and needs to be nursed back to health, and adores her from afar. So the first one, the killer, the mass killer, is played by Wang Yu, surprise, surprise, and the caring, nurturing healer is played by Luo Li. So Chung Pei is between these two men. This is the notional dynamic, and of course it's straight out of the melodrama tradition. These affairs of the heart, this how can I choose, I love them both. This stuff is routine for the genre, and Zhang Jie plays lip service to it. However, before he shot the film, he rewrote the script. And you, as you will see when you watch the film, he did not do this to make a Chung Pei film. He's not very interested in the Golden Swallow character, despite the title of the film. He's interested in the Wang Yu character. So what he did in the rewrite and in the shooting was to turn it into a Wang Yu film as opposed to a Chung Pei film. A shift, a very symbolic shift from the female star to the male star. And this is a film in which Wang Yu kills literally hundreds of people. There's a famous sequence about halfway through when he slaughters an entire hall full of people, and is last seen in spotless white uniform of his own, marching across a field of dead corpses, littering the ground everywhere, picking his way very carefully as he steps across the corpses. He's done it all single-handedly and without suffering so much as a blood stain on his own spotless uniform at this time. So this wonderful set piece, I saw the film, I guess it would be in the early 70s. It was released in Britain and the States under the ridiculous title Girl with a Thunderbolt Kick. In that Chung Pei doesn't do any kicking in the film, but anyway, she's not the protagonist anymore. She was supposed to be, but not under Zhang Jie. Zhang Jie made the man the protagonist. So, but I remember being very, very, the film is in some ways rather ridiculous, but in other ways very impressive as a sort of mythological piece. I wasn't very taken by the melodrama aspects, but I was very taken by the swordplay aspects of it, and in particular by this extraordinary scene or spectacle of Wang Yu in spotless white, marching through a field, a sea of corpses of people he's just slain. And I'd never seen anything quite like it before. I think it was a first for me. We've started talking about actors, so we may as well note that there are several actors who get their prominence in the films in this set. And they are, of course, Chung Pei herself, Wang Yu himself, Luo Li, who appears in quite a few films, usually in good guy roles here at this early stage in his career, but also several supporting characters. There's a guy called Chang Yi, who is in fact a Taiwanese actor, Taiwanese trained actor, who has moved to Hong Kong at the invitation of Shaw Brothers. And he stars in a couple of films, most famously, or most notably, Bells of Death, in which he is very impressive. He's the driven protagonist and does a really very good job in this picture, very striking. You find him also in one of the other films on the set. That was a film, well, I think it's one of the standout films in this box. It was the first film scripted at Shaw Brothers by a Taiwanese writer called Chiu Gang-jian. Chiu Gang-jian was dead now, sadly. He died not long ago. But the very notable figure at the time, because he went on to become probably the most prominent scriptwriter, most prestigious scriptwriter in Hong Kong. He wrote films for An Hui, for Stanley Kwan, and for Eddie Fong, and a number of other important directors and important films. He did do quite a number of genre pieces for Shaw Brothers, but he came from a background doing, prestigious avant-garde theatre in Taiwan. I mean, he was the first man to translate Genet into Chinese. He was the first man to translate Beckett into Chinese. Ionesco into Chinese. He's versed in modernist literature and modernist theatre, and he came to Hong Kong as a very highly educated man, and he found out that writing 4 scripts a year for Shaw Brothers, he didn't start off at Shaw Brothers when he arrived at Hong Kong, but he was brought in by the head of script department at Shaw's. He found that this was a rather comfortable living compared with what he could earn as a freelance writer out there in the market, writing for newspapers and other places. They didn't pay much. Shaw's were not noted for generosity of payment either, but relative to the wider sector, newspapers, for example, and smaller film companies, they were better. And maybe writers were treated better than actors. I mean, I don't know. Actors and directors were poorly paid. The reason there was a great exodus to the newly founded Golden Harvest in 1970 is that everybody thought they would be paid more at Golden Harvest. They responded warmly to the idea of greater creative freedoms, but even more warmly to the idea of better pay packets. That was what really drove them. And when Bruce Lee came along, Bruce Lee came back to Hong Kong, having been a child actor in 50s movies. He came back to Hong Kong as a grown-up, frustrated by the lack of opportunities in Hollywood. He did have a meeting with Shaw Brothers. Shaw's made their usual derisory offer. You know, you will work for us for 5 years, we'll pay you $5 a month, and you will do everything we tell you to do. And he said, no thanks, and walked away, having done a few costume tests for, a typical Shaw Brothers Wuxia film, where he's wearing period costume with a period hairstyle. And went instead to Golden Harvest, to Raymond Chow. And Raymond Chow, who was in many ways very similar to Run Run Shaw, it must be said, his personality, but he was more modern, more forward-thinking, less stuck in his ways. And Raymond Chow said, okay, why don't we do this? Let's have a 2-picture contract. We won't pay you anything or anything much. You will work with directors we assign to you, but we'll see how it goes. We'll make the 2. If that goes well, we'll meet again and renegotiate. We'll do some deal for the future. Well, those 2 films, as we know, were both enormously successful, first in Hong Kong, then in the region, and ultimately globally. They were known as The Big Boss and Fist of Fury, originally in Hong Kong. I think in America they were both retitled as Chinese Connection and Fist of Fury, I think, was co-opted, transplanted to the other film. Anyhow, the titles were scrambled, but those 2 films, one shot in Thailand, the other one in the studio in Hong Kong, but about the anti-Japanese struggle in the 1930s, were the 2 breakthrough films for Bruce Lee as an adult, and they transformed Golden Harvest. Suddenly, as a company that had been struggling and on the verge of bankruptcy only a year into its life, was riding very, very high indeed. And Shaw, of course, was extremely jealous and unhappy about this. So, and once that had happened, Golden Harvest and Raymond Chow rethought their entire business plan. Suddenly, the next thing after those 2 films was that Raymond Chow sat down with Bruce Lee and formed a company called Concord and said, Concord will produce future Bruce Lee films. We will be partners in it. Golden Harvest will provide the necessary finance, but profits will be shared, and you will be the beneficiary of your own hard work. So Way of the Dragon is started as a Concord production in Hong Kong, and then Enter the Dragon is a Warner Brothers Concord co-production in Hong Kong. Game of Death would have been another Concord production if it had been finished at the time. So you have this, and that sets the pattern. Suddenly everybody wants to do it. King Hu comes back from Taiwan and starts King Hu Film Productions with financing from Golden Harvest, and he makes The Fate of Li Khan. Sammo Hung, veteran martial arts star, you can see him very briefly in one film in this set, starts one of several companies. He starts actually 3 or 4 companies with different partners under Golden Harvest. Michael Hui, the comedian who has come from television to Shaw Brothers, has made 4 movies at Shaw Brothers, all of them sexist, satirical comedies, very demeaning to women, but very impressive for him and his vein of humour. Michael Hui leaves Shaw Brothers after those 4 films, goes to Golden Harvest, starts Hui Brothers Film Company, and with financing from Raymond Chow, has a string of major hits through the 1970s. So it sets the pattern. You know, this is the future in Golden Harvest. So when people ask why did Shaw's go into some kind of decline, it's because Run Run did nothing of the sort. I mean, he instead handed control to Mona Fong, his lady wife, mistress, whatever. And she, I think, lacked the imagination, lacked perhaps the competence. She certainly lacked the perspective, the aesthetic perspective, to create hits. And so after the 70s was a very productive period for Shaw Brothers. Shaw Brothers, I mean, nearly all the famous Shaw Brothers films were made in the 70s. In the 80s, they went into a slow decline, which eventually led to them petering out completely in the mid-80s, when production ceased on a regular basis. The theatre chain was sold off, and Run Run himself focused exclusively on his television production executive role. Mona was left holding the pieces of the film business, but there was not much for her to do. I think the short answer to why did Shaw Brothers go into a decline is that Run Run himself and his executive arm, Mona Fong, were resistant to the idea of change, would not give up the kind of control that they'd enjoyed, would not give up their old business practices of paying people very little, not paying bonuses if a film was a big hit or anything like that. Certain people were favoured. I mean, Zhang Che was favoured as a key director. Li Hanxiang was favoured as a key director. And there were a number of other people who enjoyed certain prestigious benefits from being within the company. But those were not the actors on the whole. The actors remained poorly paid and under no incentive to stick with the company. And a lot of the second rank, third rank, fourth rank directors were atrociously paid. Even Zhang Che was paid very little. It's interesting, Jackie Chan made a film called Project A, and I remember visiting the shoot of that film. They'd taken over an old police house, actually, in central Kowloon, in Tsim Sha Tsui district, and it was supposed to be a police office in the film, in Project A. And they were decorating it. They somehow brought in a whole stack of giant ledgers to decorate it, to make it look very bureaucratic. That was the idea. And visiting the set, I just leafed through some of these ledgers that was lying around decorating the set. And they turned out to be old Shaw Brothers production ledgers. Don't know where they'd come from exactly, but I looked up out of interest to see what was in them. They were mostly written in English with some additions in Chinese, and found that Zhang Che, for example, was paid only 3,000 Hong Kong dollars for directing one film in the early 70s. Now, Zhang Che was a prolific director who didn't actually direct much of the stuff that his name is on. I mean, in 1972 alone, he's credited with, I think, 10 features. That's nearly one a month, but it's widely known. And he says in his own memoirs that he didn't direct those films. I mean, he admits, frankly, that when the film, it says co-directed by Wu Ma, or co-directed by the ex-cinematographer Bao Xueli, or, co-directed by somebody else, the other guy did it. Gui Jihong, for example, has credit on a couple of Zhang Che films, and they are actually Gui Jihong films. Zhang Che's name was being exploited ruthlessly by Run Run Shaw to promote pretty much every hard action film that came along in 1972, irrespective of whether or not Zhang Che had had anything to do with the making of the thing. So he's credited as co-director just to give the prestige of his name on the poster. I referred a couple of times to Zhang Che's memoirs, and I should perhaps draw to your attention the fact that they are available in English. This is not a very good translation, but it was published by the Hong Kong Film Archive, and it's a quite interesting source. It's a very, very ego-driven book and somewhat defensive. If anybody has said anything bad about him, or, for example, Stanley Kwan, who is an out gay director, made a documentary for British television initially called Yan plus or minus Yin, Gender in Chinese Cinema. And he makes an interview with the elderly Zhang Che in the film, in which he raises with him the question of sublimated or barely sublimated homosexuality in some of his work. I mean, it is true that, probably the last 70 films in his filmography have hardly any women in them, which cannot be entirely a coincidence. And Kwan, at that time, this was made in the mid-90s, so it's before Shaw Brothers sold off its back catalogue to the company Celestial, and Kwan was denied access to any clips. There was no access to any Shaw Brothers material for the documentary. He couldn't illustrate what he was talking about or what the questions were rooted in with clips from the actual films. But that was Shaw Brothers' policy. It was Mona's policy specifically. Mona would just say routinely no to everything because they were holding out for big money from some big buyer, which turned out eventually to be Celestial. Anyhow, Stanley Kwan, of course, noted that after Shaw's stopped production, Zhang Che carried on directing, and he made films for several companies in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, and ultimately in the mainland too. And Stanley looked at one of the mainland films from late in the career called The Slaughter in Xi'an, which is about an attempted military coup in the mid-1930s in Xi'an. And he was surprised to find that it has a lot of footage in it in slow motion of young men, mostly not wearing shirts, rolling around on the floor together, and that it also has a graphic sequence of a young man being impaled by the ass on a giant metal spike. He is hoisted up and then plunged down onto the spike. So it's a kind of death by sodomy, as it were, but the sodomy carried out by a big metal spike. It's a very hair-raising clip, it must be said. And so Stanley includes this. He was able to get the rights to this stuff and puts it into the documentary. So it's absolutely worth a look if you want to. The film itself I don't recommend, the Slaughter in Xi'an, but if you want a summary of what Stanley Kwan was going on about when he made the documentary and his line of questioning to Zhang Che, who denies it. It says there's no connection between homosexuality and male heroism. I'm interested in Yangang, in staunch masculinity. I'm not interested in this. I've nothing against gays, but my heroes are not gay. They're not. Nothing like that. Nothing like that. Well, okay. There's a whole chunk of this book that is dedicated to this argument, and he denounces Stanley Kwan for having the temerity to ask him, and also for having misunderstood the basic things. That he said in Chinese literature, you go back in Chinese literature, the records of the historian, you look back at great Ming Dynasty novels like The Water Margin or All Men Are Brothers, also same book. Then they have the prototype for all this. It's about brotherhood. It's not about secret coupling in the bushes or anything of that stuff. It's all wholesome, good-hearted male comradeship. So okay, sure. I happened to be in Hong Kong in 2002, which was the year that Zhang Che died as an old man. And I went to his wake in Hong Kong, which was organised by mostly by actors. There are some interesting names missing from the list who sponsored this or supported it, put it together. But the usual suspects are mostly there. And several of them were his godchildren. He actually became godfather to a number of the young actors who were his protégés over the years. And they put together this big memorial event for him, which I attended. This was the brochure, the little brochure that was produced for this, and it has a number of rather wonderful photos. It has some text, about the man, a little text written by the man, a list of all the people who are sponsoring it, which does include, I see, Danny Lee and David Chiang. The others are mostly film executives and crew members and such, but as I said, there are, Di Lung is a name conspicuously missing, and Fu Sheng obviously was dead by this time, so he couldn't take part in it. But in any event, it's an interesting document, and it's rather beautifully produced here. The front is a long list of Zhang Che's films, the films he directed, and it's about nearly 80 of them. And the rest is, apart from a picture of him in old age, is surrounded by stills from the films or photos from the production of the films or dinners that he enjoyed with various stars and other people. So that was a quite memorable occasion. And that was put together by, as I said, the friends and supporters of Zhang Che, around the same time that the archive published his memoirs in a translation. I think that may be out of print now, but you may still be able to get copies of it if you search around. I would also, while we're talking about this, I would also recommend a book published in 1981 by the Hong Kong Film Festival. The Hong Kong Film Festival was a pioneering initiative started in '77 to do something about raising the level of film culture in Hong Kong. And the festival made it its business from the second year onwards to publish a volume of essays about whatever special topic they'd chosen to focus on that year. So in the second year it was Cantonese melodramas of the 1950s and 60s. And in the third year it was Hong Kong kung fu films. No, that's not right. The third year it was a comparison of Mandarin and Cantonese films, considered to be great films of the formative years in the 50s and 60s. And then in the fourth year, it was Kung Fu films, and in the fifth year, it was swordplay films or Wuxia films. And the book of essays that accompanied that has been reprinted and is, I think, still available, probably. And I commend it to you. This is its cover. Rather nice design of many types of spear and blades that are wielded in such films. So I can recommend both this and the previous year's study of Kung Fu films, because the Kung Fu films volume contains an essay translated, shortened but still translated, by Sek Kei, who was probably the best senior film critic in Hong Kong, and he attempts a history of the evolution of the martial arts genre, which is absolutely a good read and throws up many interesting ideas.
好，给你。啊？
Let's try and finish with the question of why martial arts cinema took off in a big way in the mid-60s, spurred on by King Hu's pioneering effort with Come Drink With Me, but more particularly by Zhang Che's efforts at Shaw Brothers. Well, the first thing to note is the historical context. In 1966, the Cultural Revolution breaks out in China. In the late 50s, Mao caused the death of millions by famine. And Mao and his third wife, Jiang Qing, eventually launched a putsch in '65. The first shots were fired, as it were, metaphorical shots, were fired in '65, and it took off in a big way in '66. And it became known as the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. And what this was really about, we now know, was Mao regaining power. And putting his wife and her associates into executive power to control everything from the culture onwards. As we also know, this resulted in a decade of complete economic and social chaos in China, the persecution of many people who Jiang Qing saw as her enemies, and the overturning of most of the conventional economic functioning of the society. So anybody in authority was fair game to be toppled. So this was viewed at the time, particularly across the border from Hong Kong, with absolute bewilderment. Undoubtedly, there were some leftist students in Hong Kong who thought this was wildly exciting, just like the leftist students in Paris who were celebrated to Jean-Luc Godard's film La Chinoise, are excited by it, misunderstand it, and celebrate it and try to enact what they think of as Maoist principles in the revolution in Paris, which of course culminates in May '68 with the demonstrations on the streets and so on. But all of this is rooted, I think, in a rather faulty understanding of what was actually going on in China at the time. And in Hong Kong, the majority of people were alarmed and dismayed by this, particularly in '67 when it spilled over to some degree into the streets of Hong Kong itself. There were anti-colonial riots in Hong Kong in '67. There was violence on the streets. There were pitched battles being fought. There were demonstrations. There were explosions. Guns were found from somewhere, but more particularly, gunpowder was found from somewhere, and bombs were made. Homemade bombs were made. As a result of that, it's still to this day illegal to let off fireworks in Hong Kong unless it's the government who's doing it. So firecrackers, for example, you still hear the sound of firecrackers sometimes in the New Territories, but in urban Hong Kong, never, because they are the police will be down on you like a ton of bricks if firecrackers went off. That's because the small explosives used in firecrackers and other fireworks can be pooled to make bombs. So when Tsui Hark made his film Dangerous Encounter First Kind and has kids letting off bombs in cinemas, that had to be completely suppressed because nothing could possibly be more subversive than a throwback to the terrifying days of 1967. John Woo was involved in all of that process. He later became Zhang Che's assistant director, and he later celebrated his own memories of the period in his film Bullet to the Head, which has, the first half hour of which is essentially not just a celebration of the friendship between three young men, but also a graphic reconstruction of the riots on the streets of Hong Kong in '67. Gives you quite a good first-hand impression of what they were like, what was going on at that time. So it's in that climate that martial arts cinema, Wuxia, becomes a big thing. And Zhang Che succeeds gradually. You won't see it so much in the 4 films by him in this set, but from that point onwards, from about 1970 onwards, Zhang Che becomes unmovably masculine in his focus. He stops paying any kind of lip service to the old melodrama traditions. The characters are no longer lovelorn. There are no hapless women. There are no women dressed as men. There are none of these contrivances of the melodrama tradition. Instead, it's just boys, boys, boys all the time, topless as much as possible. So you even get a glimpse of Wang Yu's buttocks in one of these films, and I think it's in The Assassin, as I remember right. It's 2 frames. It's incredibly fleeting, but with a judicious use of the pause function, you could inspect them if you wish to. Fascinating that he persuaded that to happen. There's actually the young woman in the film is also treated to a similar flash of nudity with her bare breasts, but it's very clearly a body double in her case. You can tell from the framing that this is not the actress who has been forced into this indignity, but some substitute, some other anonymous female has been pressed into service. But again, it's very, very brief. And I'm sure it's there mainly to be an opposite and opposing function to Wang Yu's buttocks. Anyway, there we are. From about 1970 onwards, he's not interested anymore in paying lip service to the melodrama tradition. He's creating his own macho yang gang tradition of all-male action heroes, in which the heroes preferably die valiant deaths, sometimes by suicide, sometimes by being slaughtered by their enemies, but their heroes to the end. The intention here was never to provide commentary on the films. I mean, the films speak for themselves, and you'll see for yourself that the quality varies considerably. There are some extremely accomplished and innovative films. There are some that are a bit journeyman, I mean, much less inspired. And you'll see that, so the quality is a bit uneven. For my money, the best directed of the films is Yue Feng's Bells of Death. As I said, Yue Feng was a veteran director who had worked in Shanghai in the 30s, in Hong Kong from the late 40s, and had every kind of genre under his belt, and who carried on directing. He ended up making martial arts films at Shaw Brothers, and he made very accomplished, powerful films. I think the last 3 films in his filmography are all very impressive, but so are many of the early ones. I mean, he's the classiest director working in this set. Sadly, it's only one of his films this time. But Zhang Che is obviously the key figure for the genre. And Zhang Che is the one who led us away from figures like Cheng Pei Pei, I mean, Golden Swallow being the graphic demonstration of what he did. Charged with making a sequel to Come Drink With Me, he turned it into a Wong Yu film. So she's in it, Cheng Pei Pei is in it, she plays Golden Swallow again, but she's a supporting character in her own film. Wang Yu's heroism is the thing. And the fact that he's driven by a great love for her, which he demonstrates by slaughtering everyone in sight, is in a way a throwback to the melodrama tradition. It's by way of being almost a last gasp of it, but it points the way forward for Zhang Che, who is from this point on going to focus more and more and more exclusively on male heroism. So I would say that the roots of wuxia cinema of the late 60s, quite complicated. They have something to do with the political turmoil in China, which spills over into the streets of Hong Kong for a short time. They have, with visible violence taking place, people feeling in fear of their lives because of who knows what will happen if you walk down the street today, go to the local shop. A situation, of course, dramatized in many of the films. So this is it's not too much of a stretch to make a comparison between what happens on screen and what's happening in real life at that moment. But at the same time, there's the ongoing influence of written martial arts fiction, which tends to be rather fantastical, and some filmmakers steer away from that because they think the special effects available to them in Hong Kong at the time will not be up to it. Certainly, the visual effects in Hong Kong Cantonese films, martial arts films of the 1950s, are pretty primitive by any standard. I mean, lovably so in a way. They look like Georges Méliès's trick films of the early years of the 20th century because they're so primitive. But they wouldn't pass muster by modern day standards, and Hollywood films certainly had left that kind of primitive trick making behind, even in the days before CGI. So you have an avoidance of the contrivances of martial arts fiction, the more fantastical elements of martial arts fiction, the magical powers. You get traces of it in the film still. People can still leap over walls and people can still perform a few weightless feats. But I gather in Tiger Boy, the missing Zhang Che film from '64, there was a scene in which the antagonists clash in mid-air with swords, that they're both flying and they have a kind of duel in mid-air, as it were, because they're flying towards each other. Well, I haven't seen it, so I can't really tell you what exactly happens in this film. However, that kind of thing doesn't happen very much. It's the films are more kind of earthbound, as it were, and the fantastical stuff is mostly left off screen. Sometimes it's to do with the mystical powers of a great sword of swords, for example. The sword in that movie is supposedly endowed with some kind of mystical power. Not terribly convincing, it must be said, but still, it's the MacGuffin of this plot. And the third tranche of influence obviously still comes from Japan. If you see samurai films of the 60s and 50s, with a penchant for youthful rebellion, a sense that anarchy is possible, that bad guys can do truly appalling things to their victims, then that is what feeds into the martial arts genre too. For the first time in films like Bells of Death, for example, the bad guys are truly bad guys. Bells of Death was a script based on a Henry Hathaway Western. Henry Hathaway made a vehicle for Steve McQueen called Nevada Smith in '66. And it's about a kid whose parents are slaughtered by some bad guys and devotes his life to tracking them down and getting revenge. That's exactly the plot of Bells of Death. So although it's been rethought in Chinese terms and it's not an incident-for-incident recapitulation of the Hathaway picture, as I said, written by the very distinguished Chiu Gang-jian, who is a fabulous writer and brilliantly inventive and very original in the context of Hong Kong Shaw Brothers production systems. Well, in that film, the bad guys are truly obnoxious, and that becomes an acknowledgement of the terrible things that can happen in society. There's a presumption behind the film that the audience will be shocked and horrified by the appalling things that these bad guys do, but also that they will take it in their stride, that they know there are forces out there who do behave as badly as this. It's not framed in political terms, although it's not much of a stretch to push it into political arenas, but it's a way of bringing home to the viewer in the late 1960s that the world can be a very hostile, a very dangerous, and a very threatening place.